with Professor Greg Carleton on war in Putin's Russia. My name is Marian Hunt, and I'm the Director of Lifelong Learning and Travel in the Office of Alumni Engagement. Our goal is to engage the community in the intellectual vigor of the university through faculty presentations like this, our international group travel program, and our virtual book group. One of the advantages of virtual presentations like this is that we can bring them to you in a timely manner. And in this case, on a topic that both highlights the expertise and research of our world-class faculty and puts an incredibly important current event in context. Before I turn it over to Professor Carleton, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. You'll notice your audio and video has been turned off to eliminate any distraction and disruption from background noise. We'll have an audience Q&A session after the presentation. And if you would like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function on the lower right portion of your screen. This webinar is going to be recorded and will be uploaded to the Tufts Alumni YouTube channel. My colleague Amy will post the link to that page, and you'll receive an email when the video is ready for viewing. And while you're there, please feel free to check out some of the other great presentations we've had by faculty and alumni. You'll also notice that closed captioning is on. If you'd like to turn this feature off, click Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen and click on Hide Subtitles. Lastly, I'd like to call attention to our community values. Our goal is to create an environment where everyone feels welcome to participate in respectful conversation and ask questions. Amy will post those values in the chat box now as well. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Greg Carleton, Professor of Russian Studies and former chair of the Department of International Literary and Cultural Studies. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan and his BA from the University of Virginia, and has taught at Tufts for over 25 years. His specialties include Russian culture, literature, and history. He teaches on a wide range of topics, including courses for the program in international relations. His current research focuses on how Russia looks to its past and uses that history to help shape national identity and situate itself in the world. He's the author of 3 books on Russia, the latest being Russia, the Story of War, especially relevant to today's conversation. So please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Greg Carleton.
Thank you, Marianne, Nicole, and Amy for putting this together, and I'm very happy to be here this evening with you. And I'd like to talk, before I begin though, I'd like to explain that what I won't be talking about are the tragic facts of what is occurring in Ukraine at this time. As you well know, there are reputable media sites and venues to keep up with as much as possible with what really is going on the ground. Instead, I'd like to focus on the ideas and images that permeate behind the scenes in Russia, that is the official narratives of the war propagated by the state. This is in no way, and I want to preface this by saying that the entire talk, in fact, this is in no way to condone or give those ideas credence, but rather it comes from the belief that even in these dire circumstances of today, it is better to be aware of the motivating stories from the other side. Okay, so on February 24th, all right, on February 24th, my screen's not advancing for the PowerPoint. I'm hitting the thing.
Okay, hang on a second, Greg.
Yeah,
maybe
sorry about this.
Why don't you unshare and I'll share mine.
I'll share.
Unshare yours and I'll share mine.
Okay.
Give us just a second here.
I apologize for this.
That's all right. Let's see here. All right. We're going to get there in just a second, folks. No worries. Here we go.
Okay, there we go. So if you could, yeah, just advance it one screen.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so on February 24th, the day of the invasion of Ukraine, Putin asked Russians to swallow 2 of the biggest lies marking the new century. Now, one of these is primarily political and seeks to deny Ukrainian sovereignty, the right to be independent, both as a country and as a nation and a people. And the other one, the other lie, is military, centering on World War II, that he seeks to extend to the present day and beyond. And it's the second one that I would like to address today, because its ramifications are far greater than any one country It draws upon an admittedly rich Russian history extending back 1,000 years. Now, the military lie Putin asked Russians to swallow is straightforward. World War II did not end in a bunker in Berlin in 1945. Instead, the Nazi threat went underground, only to re-emerge in the 1990s inside the meteoric rise of the United States as the sole preeminent world power following the breakup of the Soviet Union and before the rise of China. And from that period, from the ashes of the Cold War in the 1990s, the tentacles of Nazism spread, not through goose-stepping or swastikas, waiting around or something like that, but through aggressive imperialism that was manifest most overtly in wars of aggression against countries like Iraq, which the United States invaded in 2003, and covertly by the expansion of NATO as a wolf in sheep's clothing to the very borders of Russia itself. First taking over, of course, the countries of the former Soviet bloc, like Poland and the Czech Republic in 1999, and then the former republics of the Soviet Union itself, like the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in 2004. Now, according to Putin's speech on February 24th, the same Nazi threat has taken feet in Ukraine, seized control of that nation, and shown its true colors in a, quote, blitzkrieg against Eastern Ukrainians and, quote, a genocide against Russian speakers. These are the words he actually used. Now, in the face of this existential threat, Russia, according to this narrative, since Ukraine is just part of Russia, or should be, Russia began its, quote, special military operation as a preventive, that is essentially defensive measure, because as the world knows, the failure of appeasement against Hitler in 1938 shows that military force, not negotiating or diplomacy, is the only way to stop Nazism. Now, of course, this is quite a tall tale and is false throughout. But like any myth worth its salt, it can muster certain facts of history to substantiate this narrative. Now, it is true that far-right neo-Nazi elements have arisen on Ukrainian territory, most infamously in the guise of the, quote, right sector. Yet it should be noted, so too, such groups have risen as well in many countries in Europe, including Russia and the United States as well. And it's also true that NATO has expanded directly to Russia's borders and does constitute a military alliance originally formed to contain the Soviet Union. In this version of history, or Putin's version of history, whatever peaceful pretenses NATO might have had in forming, from the Russian perspective, it represents nothing less than a military coalition targeting Russia today, since the Soviet Union no longer exists and thus can be seen in the same way. But tall tale aside, for Putin, this myth means quite more than just a cover for invasion today. That's important, okay? Soviet Russia's fight against Nazi Germany during the Second World War has been not just a dance to promote, let's say, the invasion of Ukraine, but it is a center of national pride. It drives a sense of unity. And today in Russia, it's become a foundational myth for a new Russia around which a civic religion has developed. If you could advance the screen, please, Marianne.
Sure. Greg, can you try to come in a little bit closer to your microphone?
If I know where it is.
Yeah, there we go. I got the slide.
Okay, thank you. I'm as close to my laptop as I can be. So I apologize.
That's all right. That sounds better. All right, thank you.
Oh, okay, thanks. Okay. So let me just repeat this then. So in other words, his use of the rise of Nazism in Ukraine is not just focused as a cover for that invasion. Rather, it speaks to this foundational myth for a new Russia, which is formed as a kind of civic religion through which all Russians can now identify. And we see this civic religion manifest most spectacularly, but not solely, most spectacularly, for example, on May 9th. That is Victory Day in Europe. And here are some obviously scenes that we will see. It'll be very interesting to see what happens this May 9th. Okay, but just as a digression right there. But anyway, but this civic religion has its holy sites and temples just as well, like museums and the Victory Park complex in Moscow. It also has its scriptures, its official histories and textbooks. against which any blasphemous speech is now criminalized and subject to prosecution in laws that have just passed regarding the spread of, quote, fake news. Now, why is this the case? Why has Russia latched onto war, almost exclusive among nations today? Why is it latched onto war as a foundation of national identity? Well, for one reason, the story behind it is almost unparalleled in history and overwhelms all others with the superlatives one can draw from this story as the foundational myth of Russia. In the greatest conflict ever, Soviet Russia led the way in defeating the greatest army led by the greatest villain the world has seen, and thereby saves it from the greatest evil it has ever known. And in so doing, no country has paid a greater price in war. And the official number now standing at nearly 27 million lives, or approximately 1 out of every 7 Soviet citizens, man, woman, and child. Or, put it another way, following the German invasion of June 22nd, 1941, nearly 20,000 Soviets, including, of course, Ukrainians, lost their lives each day, every day, for 1,418 days until the end of the war. Now, the key to the success of this idea is the added emphasis that World War II is not an exclusive or unique chapter of Russian history, but rather the culmination and confirmation of the country's exceptional status. No other nation, so it goes, has been the perennial target of foreign invasion since it came into being 1,000 years ago. Every century in its past can be redrawn centering on a foreign invasion. If we could advance to the next screen, please. So, for example, if we could hit these as I give them to you, Marianne. So, for the 13th century, the Mongols invade. If we could go forward on the animation, no, we have, there we go. The Mongols invade, and they will occupy or control Russia for essentially 200 years. All right, and then in the 16th century, the Crimean Tatars will come, and they will invade, and they will burn Moscow. If we could have the next one. And then again in the 17th century, the Poles will invade and they will burn Moscow as well. We have that one. And then in the 18th century, Sweden, which was a powerhouse at the time, they invade Russia, but they will be defeated. And then, of course, in the 19th century, we of course have Napoleon. All right. And now the key thing is that Napoleon's army is often seen from the Russian perspective as a precursor to NATO. And why is that? It's because Napoleon's army was only about half French. The other half was made up of many nations of Europe, or many peoples of Europe at that time, such as Poles, Germans, Italians, Croats, and so forth. So in other words, Napoleon's army was a coalition of Western powers that united against Russia. Okay, if we have that slide, please, Marianne. And then, of course, in the 20th century, we have Hitler invading as well. And the key thing that Hitler can be seen as a precursor to NATO as well, because the German army was, of course, not just German, but included foreign satellites as well, such as Hungarians, Romanians, Italians, and others also. So that can be seen as a precursor to NATO, as a Western coalition united against Soviet Russia. Now, what is more, too, is that these invaders, okay, are not just small I invaders, but they're some of the biggest that history has. If you could advance the next one with World War II, Marianne. There should be a Hitler one there. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Yeah. There we go. But in other words, so these are not just invaders or foreign invasions. These are the biggest ones that we have, at least for Europe, in terms of the Mongols, Napoleon, and Hitler. So it's Russia doesn't do lowercase history. Let's just put it that way, okay? But from this, and this is an essential point of Russian identity, so construed through this through this image of foreign invasion, is that it lives amidst a never-ending war, where cycles of peace are their intermissions before the next invasion. And in this life cycle, Russia is always on the defensive and always the victim. That's going to be key here as we jump to Ukraine for 2022. Now, there are two essential caveats to this myth of exceptionalism. It should be underscored that it's not just a tool of state propaganda. One can hear some variant of it across Russian culture. It's in its movies, on TV, in schools, in religious tracts, and even outside of state control. And that's very important. And there's virtually no venue in Russia today where one can't hear some feature of it. And equally important, this is not a new thing or a product of Putin's time. Russia, as an exceptional nation born in war and foreign invasion, is something that has circulated for centuries, in fact, regardless of what flag has flown over the Kremlin. And this is crucial. In fact, if we look back to famous names of the 19th century, writers like Pushkin, who represent something of a liberal / progressive bent, or someone like Dostoevsky, who represents more of a conservative bent, both of them, across the political spectrum, both of them awarded their nation pedigree status for serving as a shield to protect Russia, and by extension, Western civilization, from what was claimed then existential threats, be it Napoleon or the Mongols. Now, this brings us back to the present day. We have a motivating myth. It has matured for centuries with deep roots in Russia's history. It has solidity across Russian culture and across its politics. It's a narrative appeal, that storyline that cannot be denied when it comes to nations telling stories about themselves with all those superlatives, right? And yet this myth, this story, this motivating narrative, this cover for the invasion of Ukraine fell flat in about 2 weeks. And that is really surprising. Now, why it fell, okay, and so profoundly, all right, why did that happen? And I believe there are a number of reasons why. I'd like to highlight just two for right now. First of all, it's the unexpected strong resistance of the Ukrainian people to the sheer ludicrousness of trying to apply this story to Ukraine, that it was infested with Nazis and things like that. And especially, again, when you have ties of families and friends across the borders between Ukraine and Russia. But there's also a generational element as well. Putin's information war, as it's often called, is quite behind the times and is in no way capable of competing with the fully digitized world of 2022, one saturated with TikTok, Instagram, smartphones, and the like, which have overwhelmed the dinosaurs in the Russian propaganda machine. However, in this failure of that narrative, Putin in March has unveiled a plan B, a second narrative line, a second motivating story that can be quite as strong as the first. It still promotes Russia as exceptional, and it goes back centuries, just like the first one. And it draws upon and, in fact, builds off that first mythic narrative. And this is Fortress Russia. Russia as an island unto itself amidst a hostile world, beset by enemies on all sides. And this idea, this Fortress Russia, has been a staple also of how Russia has imagined itself, predating the Nazis, in fact, of the 20th century. And for this idea of Russia, we can go all the way back to the 16th century with Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, as he's more commonly known. The ruling elite of Muscovy, as Proto-Russia was then known, presented the idea of it being the third Rome, the God-ordained sole home or true capital of Christianity. Marianne, if you could advance to the next slide, please. Okay. Now, what is third Rome? You might have heard something like that, whatever. It was very powerful in the 16th century, and then it got resurrected again in the 19th century, and then again now in the 21st century as well. And it doesn't matter if one believes in this through a metaphysical divine lens or a secular lens. It's very, very important to understand this idea of Fortress Russia. Now, what is third Rome? The first Rome, the Rome of the Vatican that we know, right? That was the first capital, of course, of Christianity. However, when Christianity split in 1054 in the Great Schism between a Western Latinate side and a Greek Orthodox Eastern side, The first Rome, the Rome of the Vatican, was automatically disqualified in the eyes of the Eastern side. Now it was not the capital of true Christianity, but rather the den of heretics and schismatics and the minions of the devil and things like that. The true capital of Christianity, the second Rome, was now Constantinople. That is the capital of the Byzantine Empire. However, in 1453, if you recall, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, right? And it fell, therefore, again to the heretics. And this is crucial because what that meant was that in the 15th, going into the 16th century, when Ivan IV comes into power as the first Tsar proclaimed in Russia, is that Russia, or Muscovy it's known then, is the new bastion of Christianity, the new Rome, the third Rome, okay? It's the only place that Orthodox Christians were free of foreign control. And this is very important because in a sense, the Muscovites looked up and said, oh my God, God has blessed us. He has made us the third Rome. The first and the second Rome were compromised. And now it's us alone against the world. Now this fact of history says that time again, no other Orthodox Christians were free of foreign rule, undergirded a belief that Russian land was exceptional. And as such, always set it at odds with its neighbors, such as the Poles, the Turks, or the Balts, who by definition were of a different faith. And this idea of Russia as a true island of Christianity really gains prominence in the 19th century, as nationalists sought to redefine what made their nation, their people different from, and by definition superior to, other peoples. So prominent figures, like Dostoevsky again, he promoted this idea in his writings. And so did, for example, a famous poet, Apollon Maikov. He likened Russia, for example, to a besieged monastery. It's a very powerful image, of course, beset by enemies on all sides and only able to rely on itself. Now, the fact that at the same time, Russia was subject to foreign invasions, this is in the 19th century, most notably by Napoleon, it served to link the two ideas. Russia was a special place, and precisely because of that special nature, others on the outside have sought to destroy her through any means necessary. Now, the history of foreign invasion, combined with Russia's unique Christian heritage, gained further prominence, in fact, during the Soviet period, despite its official atheist stance. Then isolationism took on a different but related form. Before the end of World War II, Soviet Russia was the only country in the world professing a belief in Marxism, and such was a pariah in the eyes of many countries in the world. The expanse of Soviet control over other nations after the war, like in Eastern Europe, for example, therefore could be seen as a defensive maneuver, a hedge against future invaders, since we have this cyclical view of history, which is very important because America uses its history as linear. Okay, now today, with the failure of that first narrative, okay, Putin and the others have now fully embraced this image of Russia once more, as I call it, the plan B, the second one. And the advantages in arguing this line are manifold. First of all, it definitely molds the situation now at hand. If Western sanctions have had the intent of isolating Russia, then they can have the opposite effect as well, by confirming this mythic view of its place in the world. In this guise, the sanctions merely reflect the West's continuing antagonism against Russia dating back centuries, all without having to acknowledge that what set in motion those sanctions in the first place, that is the invasion of Ukraine. It also paints Russia as once again defending itself against outside aggression, and thereby flips the role of being the villain in the conflict with Ukraine. It enforces the idea of Russia as the perpetual victim, always the underdog in the face of history's injustices and inequities. It also preserves the perception of Russia as an island of goodness and with good intentions in a hostile world. And in fact, this image of Fortress Russia can draw confirmation from the widespread boycotts of Russian culture and sports just as well. For example, as in Britain, the banning of Tchaikovsky, for example, as one concert group did, just reinforces this idea Or, for example, here in Boston, the fact that the Boston Marathon banned Russian runners, okay? This only feeds the impression that the West is preternaturally hostile to Russia, no matter where it might appear, be it a composer from the 19th century or, God forbid, runners in a marathon. Now, this switch to a new narrative line should not be dismissed in the West as just another propaganda ploy. As the war has turned more into a stalemate, this line has gained more traction, in fact, more so than the plan A, as it were. In fact, while many in Russia have opposed the invasion, which is very significant, of course, and some have left the country over it, recent polling suggests that support for Putin has stabilized precisely around this image of him as leader on the nation's ramparts defending their vital interests. And if this trend continues, then at least in terms of self-image and self-esteem, the nation will have found a satisfactory ending, no matter what outcome might come from the war with Ukraine. For the fortress Russia myth will always have the country land on its feet, even in defeat. That's a crucial point. Even when it's been defeated, it can still be successful in this idea of fortress Russia. But this notion of defeat, and I'd like to end on this note, also brings us back to Russian history, but of a different kind. In its modern age, we should not forget that Russia has fought 4 wars of choice that have become quagmires. Marianne, if you could advance to the next screen, please. So in other words, yes, Putin can draw on World War II, and he can draw on Napoleon's invasion quite a bit. But there are also other wars that are in Russia's history, also modern wars, that have profound consequences as well. Now, these 4 wars that we see, the Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, and the Soviet-Afghan War, were all wars of choice that ended up as quagmires, okay? And they ended also in defeat for Russia or the Soviet Empire. But in defeat, they caused revolutionary change in that country. In fact, regime changes, things like that. The Crimean War, okay, led to the revolution, the abolition of serfdom, right? The Russo-Japanese War, the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War led to the first Russian Revolution, unsuccessful, but the first one against the Tsar. World War I, of course, defeat in World War I led to the Bolshevik or the Soviet Revolution, of course, and this defeat in the Soviet-Afghan War helped precipitate the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so this is very important because the war in Ukraine, all right, is a quintessential war of choice on Putin's part. And frankly, it caught me by surprise. I didn't expect it to happen, okay? But it's a quintessential war of choice on Putin's part. And it now threatens to become something of a quagmire as well. And if it truly does end in failure, let's not even say defeat, but just even failure, then no narrative or storyline might save him or his regime from what comes next if history has another tale to tell. Thank you. So,
Thank you, Greg. We're just going to get all our settings all set.
I'm going to leave some time for questions. Of course, I do have to run at 6:30.
I know. You've got another
to entertaining questions. There's quite a lot more in Russian history to pull from. And
oh, I know. You're the expert, so thank you. We did have some questions rolling in even as you were talking, so I invite people to sit more if they would like. And the first one is, isn't it true that all of Europe was invasion prone, such that cycles of war were interrupted by brief cycles of peace? Why is Russia so much more threatened and in the realm of the victim than any other country?
I would say there are two reasons that Russia projects to answer that, or Russia would give to answer that question. First of all, as I mentioned before, the invasions that Russia suffers are not just lowercase invaders. Again, it's Napoleon, it's the Mongols, and it's Hitler. It doesn't get any bigger than that in history. And the fact that all 3 came to Russia is very important. One country might have gotten Hitler, another one might have gotten et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in other words, no country, so goes the idea, has that kind of pattern or history to it. Also, too, the key thing is the fact that the exceptional suffering that happened in the Second World War, that makes Russia special in that way, in the amount of death. And of course, it's Soviet death. It's not Russian death. It's the Soviet Union. But Russia will, of course, take the I don't want to say the laurels, but it'll take the mantle of the war on its shoulders. It's because of the exceptional status of the Second World War and the fact that Hitler, essentially Russia broke his back. That's where the war was won. So it's not just the idea of them being invaded by these big names. It's how they suffered, and also the fact that they ended up defeating Napoleon, and they ended up defeating Hitler as well. And the key thing is Napoleon, for example, Russia was the only country. Now, Napoleon was seen as invincible at the beginning of the 19th century. Russia was the only country attacked by Napoleon that by itself defeated him. Okay, and that was very special in the sense of what it meant and how it resonated in the 19th century. Okay, the same kind of thing we have going on in Hitler, that Russia sees itself as Soviet Russia sees itself alone in the fight, really, against Hitler's Germany until about 1944, when you have D-Day and Normandy and things like that, when the Western Allies really come onto the show. But by that time in 1944, Hitler had really already been defeated, and that was more of a question of how the war would end. So it's those three, I would say, factors that really will give the ability for Russia to claim the special status.
Okay, great, thank you. Our next question is, how does Alexander II feature in this story of war, both inside and outside of Russia, taking into consideration that there are statues of him also outside of Russia, as in Sofia and Helsinki?
Yeah, Alexander II, so he is the son of Nicholas, who starts the Crimean War. In fact, that first quagmire that I mentioned. And Nicholas, who is actually the brother of Alexander the First, who defeat. So we got some Alexanders and lots of different things to parse in the 19th century. Essentially, what you have is you have Alexander the First, who defeats Napoleon in 1812. Okay, he will die in 1825, and his brother Nicholas will come to the throne. Nicholas will take Russia into the Crimean War in 1853. He will die during the war, and so it'll be Alexander II who, in effect, oversees the defeat of Russia in the Crimean War. Now, Alexander II is seen very much in a special light. He's seen as a kind of enlightened monarch on one hand, because he did liberate the serfs. And that's very important, because serfdom was akin to slavery, but it wasn't akin to slavery in the sense through racial lens. It was more through a caste lens or a class lens. And in fact, it affected a majority of the Russian population. And so he is seen in that special light. That's why you're going to have statues of him in Russia today. And I'll get to the moment with Bulgaria, things like that, around Russia. However, it is important to know he did not liberate the serfs out of some humanitarian reasons. Okay, it was rather done because he felt that it was better to do it from above than to have them do it from below, i.e., to stave off revolution, which he did not, which in a way indirectly led to the revolutionary movements. And in fact, he'll be the first Tsar who will be assassinated in 1881 by revolutionaries who in fact feel that his liberal reforms coming from the defeat in the Crimean War didn't go far enough. Right, so he liberated the serfs, but he didn't take it as far as they wanted, and therefore they advocated violence and ended up assassinating him in 1881. Why do you see his statue, for example, in Bulgaria and things like that? It's because after the Crimean War, which ends in 1856, in colossal defeat for Russia, Russia reformed itself, liberated the serfs, reformed its military, and it came back in 1877 to fight the Ottoman Turks. And it fought the Ottoman Turks on behalf of their quote-unquote little brothers in the Balkans, for example, Bulgarians, Serbians, and things like that. And they defeated Turkey in that war in 1877. So they got their revenge, as it were. And that's why you'll see his statue, for example, in those nations' capitals, because there's not because he liberated Serbs. Rather, because there it was Russia, i.e. Orthodox Christianity, triumphant once again. And so that's very important too, because in a way, jumping to Ukraine, you can see something of that going on as well, that Putin will see Ukraine as quote unquote a little brother of some kind, that therefore his invasion is in no way an invasion, it's rather an intervention to save a family member, as it were, from the evil clutches of the West or something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, getting back to Alexander second, the question. So he has multiple roles to play, both on a domestic stage and on an international stage. He's also, for example, in Alaska, he's very famous because it's under his Tsar that Alaska was sold to the United States and stuff like that. So he's got quite a because he reigned from 1855 to 1881. So it's quite a time capsule that we have there.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we miss is the Russian connection to Alaska very often.
Yeah.
Which, when you go to Alaska, it's actually still pretty present. It's kind of
yeah. I mean, there are people who still speak Russian there, and it is.
Yeah, yeah. So I have one question. This is pretty interesting. Kind of brings us back to the more current situation is what would constitute failure? So rather than defeat, like what would be failure? And I think it's been a moving target if you listen to the Russian version, right?
Yeah. So initially, of course, I think Putin expected quite a different outcome in the first couple of days, that he would roll into Kiev, that Zelensky, the president of the Ukrainian president, would be kicked out. He would be able to install some kind of puppet regime, something like that. He would be welcomed. I think that what Putin has become is he has become a believer in his own myths and in his own lies. I don't think that was the case in the early 20th century, the early 21st century when he came to power. I think he was a cold rationalist at that time. I think what it was when he was talking myth and stuff like that, he knew what it was. He could separate the two. And he knew the cold reality and the positive like that. I think now, after having been in power for 20 years, surrounding himself with yes men, this is a common thing that happens with authoritarian figures, is they begin to believe their own lies and their own propaganda. And I think he really did believe that he would be met with open arms in Ukraine, which of course did not happen. So so therefore they have moved the goalposts, as Marianne's suggesting. And so now it's like, oh no, actually now we're just out to really kind of secure the Donbass and protect it from genocide, which is a word that is used very casually in Russian political discourse, unfortunately. And so that in Blitzkrieg, these are of course not Russian words, but they're used because of course Blitzkrieg and genocide only spells out Hitler from the Russian perspective, and so it's a way of kind of resurrecting that whole part of history when they speak in that language. So they've moved the goalposts, and now it seems to be, oh yes, if we just secure the Donbass, which was already kind of secure, then that would be victory. I don't think that's really going to sell on a domestic stage necessarily. Yes, I think it will initially, but I think within a couple of years or something, I don't think that's a victory that will last. He can claim it. I'm sure there will be some kind of special parade on May 9th, and I'm not joking. May 9th, which is 2 weeks around the corner, will be a really, really important event to see, because that's where we see myth alive. And that's Russia's day. It's everything, all the July 4th, so you can wrap up together and it's Russia's day that we July 4th, Memorial Day, take all your secular military oriented holidays and wrap them all together, and that's what you get. And so, in other words, what they probably had planned was some kind of massive parade showing, Ukrainians and Russians arm in arm and something like that. It's going to have to be quite different now. And so I think they've done is move the goalpost to some kind of, we're just going to secure the Donbass. That in no way could justify the destruction they have wrought on Ukraine, the invasion across the country, just to secure the Donbass. No, they could have literally just done that just by beefing up Russian troops in the Donbass. And in fact, what they could have done, of course, there were already Russian troops in the Donbass. They could have just officially made them there. It was always claimed that the Russians who were there fighting on the side of Ukrainian separatists in the Donbass were volunteers, or they were this, or they were that. They weren't official military units. He could have just made them official, like the little green men in Crimea in 2014, that lo and behold became real Russian soldiers. They shed their, Halloween costumes, as it were, and became formal Russian soldiers. He could have just done that. The fact that he seems to be flailing around, the fact that he's firing generals, the fact that he's putting others under house arrest, the fact that he's had a huge clampdown in the country, the fact that so many Russians have fled the country, or important Russians, important cultural figures, the ones that we don't necessarily hear about in the West, but TV commentators, people like that, they've gone silent. They've either gone, for example, to Georgia, or they've gone to Germany, or they've gone to Israel. All of that shows the Russians, even though they're saturated with the state propaganda, that things are not going right. Another key thing, I think a thing that what constitutes defeat or failure, whenever a country goes to war, this applies to almost any country, could apply to the United States, Britain, Russia, whatever, and they go to war with a motivating story. Okay, and this story was whatever it is. Okay, if that story changes midstream, that's usually not a sign that things are going well. It happened to America in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It happened to Russia in Afghanistan as well in the 1980s. It happened, in the Crimean War going back to 19. And the fact that he's changing his story so rapidly, literally in the space of weeks, that right there is a key sign to people like something's not right. Yeah. If before we were saying white and now it's black, we're saying up and now we're saying it's down. But now he will always claim victory. He will never admit defeat. No authoritarian figure can do that. He will never admit defeat. But at the same time, the victory he will try and push forward, I don't think will satisfy people to the same degree in any way whatsoever.
It's interesting what a matter of just semantics, right? Like you can't just call something different and that makes it true, right?
No, of course not. Of course not. Yeah. Of course not. I mean, that'll be another. This is where the mountain of lies just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So the first one was, of course, that there were Nazis in the Ukrainian government, and therefore we had to intervene to save them, to save Ukrainian people from the government. And now, this is victory, just securing the Donbass. And so we've lost thousands of soldiers just to secure the Donbass, when most of them were not lost in the Donbass. They were lost outside of Kiev and in the siege of Mariupol and places like that. It's one of the key things that brought down the Soviet Union was the fact that the people just got fed up with the lies that they were told by their own governments. Now, this is something that, again, happens when countries face quagmires. It happens with America and Vietnam. And, it nearly broke America when the United States had to face the fact that their government was lying to them. The Soviet Union, the fact that what happened was, it really put front and center that they had been lied to left and right. But the thing is, and they kind of knew that before, but it was the Afghan war that really brought it front and center with all the lives that were lost. That couldn't be ignored. It wasn't that you're being lied to, that, oh yeah, the shelves are full of goods over in that city, but not here, or something like that. It was that coffins were coming home. And the fact that the people were just said, no more, no more, no more, we're not going to put up with it anymore. And in fact, if you recall, for those who are viewing this tonight, the individuals who went out, if you recall, way back in 1991, when Yeltsin gained prominence standing on a tank in Moscow against the coup, that last attempt by the hard right to secure a coup and to defeat the forces of liberalism, stuff like that. The people who surrounded him, for the most part, were actually veterans of the Afghan war, who said, no more, we're not going to put up with this anymore. Wow. And so that's the key thing. So in other words, a government can only go so far on its lies. And particularly now in the 19th century, you could do that. Because after all, it takes so long, years for lies to get caught, if they get caught or exposed or whatever the word is. Today, with Instagram and TikTok, it's a matter of, look at the war crimes that happened in Bucha. They were literally an hour. It was, shown to the world, these mass graves that, that would never have happened before. And so, in a way that in today's world, in a weird, twisted way, you can lie more and more and more because media is such of that nature. But at the same time, the ability to expose those lies is that much more accentuated.
So we have a couple more questions I want to try to get to before you have to leave.
Sure.
How do nuclear weapons change the equation, if at all, for the Fortress Russia mythology?
This is where, this is an extremely good question. It's one not only my students have asked me, my mother, and I'm not laughing because it's funny, because that would spell the end of everything, obviously. This is where one hopes that if, and I do not have any insight into Putin's head, or I'm not in the Kremlin or anything like that, if he really is losing a grip on reality, would he go down the path of someone like a Hitler, who, if we bring up this analogy again, in his bunker in 1945, who literally gave what they call the Nero order, Nero meaning the burning of Rome, in March of 1945 to destroy Germany and bring down everything with him? If Hitler had had nuclear weapons, one can assume that he would have used them to essentially bring down the world on top of him, that he felt that this was a fitting end. That Germany was not deserving of victory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He had been betrayed left and right, so forth and so on, and things like that. If Putin is of that nature, then gosh, I don't know what to say. I have to assume two things. One, I hope that he's not of that nature, of that degree, because he's still appearing. One thing is, Hitler disappeared from the public limelight in the last 2 years of his life and stuff like that. And what happened in the bunker that was going on, whatever. I don't want to get too much on the Hitler stuff. That he had really lost a grip of reality. Putin is still appearing publicly, and he's still making statements, and it's quite clear that he still understands how the world works, and and things like that.
Yeah.
So the nuclear weapons associated, he will, of course, talk about it. He will, for example, when Sweden and Finland threatened, that's not a proper way to put it, have expressed a desire to join NATO, that he has said, well, I will introduce nuclear weapons into the Baltic Sea. Well, okay. But then nuclear weapons have been around, we've had them in Turkey, Russia's had them in Cuba. And so in that sense, it's a threat, of course, and it's a real threat and should be taken extremely seriously, obviously. But I don't think he could go that route. I don't think he would go that route. And also, too, finally, I hope there would be some mechanisms in the Russian military itself, or the political state, to stop that. That, in other words, if some of his generals have already balked at obeying orders or things along those lines, that someone might also balk when they get the order to launch something, because Putin knows that he could never win. There's no victory then, and there's no narrative line which is going to save an apocalyptic, apocalyptic nightmare like nuclear.
Yeah. That's what I was wondering too, about the checks and balances there, if it exists like the way it does. I mean, it's hard to say, but
yeah, it's hard to say. There is a nuclear football, etc., and someone has to have the codes. There's not a straightforward vice presidential system per se that we have like in the United States. I mean, the prime minister will become president for the interim election until interim election. But because the key thing is it's so shrouded in mystery and power, and so much of power is based on person. It's not based on law, it's not based on the Constitution, it's based on a person. And so therefore, on one hand, that gets really scary. On the other hand, therefore, one has some glimmer of hope.
Yeah, I mean, it did. Somebody just asked me the other day in a conversation, like, what would happen if Putin were no longer in power, if something happened to him through it? Like, and I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say, because it's so built around a personality.
Yeah, it really, there's no one waiting in the wings, a vice president or a person that the country could rally around, either in a liberal bent or in a conservative bent or a militaristic bent or a non-militaristic bent. There is no single individual like that. I assume it would devolve into some kind of junta, some kind of like power struggle, similar to what happened when Stalin died in 1953. People did not go out on the streets and sing, "Oh, ding dong, the witch is dead," or something like that. People went on the streets and they were confused. They didn't know what to do, because they had grown up with Stalin their whole lives, for that generation, for the most part, their adult lives. And they were just like, oh my God. And in fact, it took a good 3 years, as it were, for those power struggles to sort themselves out until Khrushchev then gained central power, but not only central power like Stalin had in 1956. I don't think it would be pretty in any way. If Putin, in other words, there's not a good outcome I don't see to this story. Either Putin wins and stays in power, or Putin is removed from power. But I don't see necessarily in the immediacy of that something good happening. Just like when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia never really got out from under the debris of that. It tried, it had that pseudo-democracy under Yeltsin, that failed. And then, of course, then you had Putin come in, the rest is history, as it were.
we've got time for one more question.
Sure.
I think, given Russia's historical narratives, do you think that this invasion of Ukraine would have been avoided absent the promise to admit Ukraine to NATO at the 2008 Bucharest summit?
Yeah. That's the big
$1 million
elephant in the
question.
room. Yeah, it's the big jumbo in the room, as it were. Uh, in other words, the expansion of NATO. NATO is what, from the Russian perspective? NATO is a military alliance that was put together to contain the Soviet Union. Okay, that was its primary reason for being. It was not a, it was not a venue for democracy or anything like that. Okay, because we didn't necessarily, extend the democratic hand to members of NATO, whatever. Okay, so it was a military alliance. All right. So therefore, if it was designed to contain the Soviet Union, if the Soviet Union collapses, then what, just by simple logic, if we were, let's say, we were on a different planet and looking down at the world, if the Soviet Union collapses, then by logic, NATO doesn't really need to exist anymore. The threat is gone. So what NATO does, however, is the exact opposite. And in fact, I don't want to get into the minutiae of the details, but in other words, it doesn't. And in fact, it grows and it expands. And it doesn't expand into Africa. It doesn't expand into Latin America. It expands towards Russia's border. And it just keeps on marching eastwards. And the point is that Russia does have legitimate complaints that the West deceived them, in the sense when they accepted a unification of Germany and that Germany would be allowed to join NATO, way back when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, that it would expand no more. That promise, it was never an official, never a signed treaty or anything like that. That promise was broken, however. And the key thing is that then it has been broken again and again and again. And so now that we have, NATO literally on the doorstep of Russia. So getting to the question of Ukraine, one of the reasons Putin invaded Georgia in 2008 was because in Georgia, they started to talk about joining NATO. And therefore, that was one of the precipitating factors when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2008, because that would automatically disqualify it from becoming a member of NATO. The same thing with the annexation of Crimea, which I think happened for multiple reasons. But one of them being in 2014, one of them being is that therefore it would presumably disqualify Ukraine from joining NATO, because any country that has borders in dispute, et cetera, would not be allowed to join, et cetera, and so forth. Okay, now, so in other words, Russia does have a legitimate right about the expansion of NATO. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you absorbing the Eastern Bloc? Why are you absorbing former Soviet republics? However, that said, that does not explain the whole situation. It doesn't explain why Putin became an autocrat. It doesn't explain the murder of journalists. It doesn't explain the clampdown on free expression in Russia. It doesn't explain all these other things. As we have, unfortunately, with I would say almost virtually all wars, why they happen are multi-causal. World War I is a perfect example. So is the Crimean War, for that matter, the Russo-Japanese War, the Soviet-Afghan War. And so that NATO's expansion is a precipitating factor, but not the precipitating factor. And it's a factor, however, that Russia can put front and central in its narrative, right? Even though, of course, NATO never has had the intentions of invading Russia. Nevertheless, Russia can always play the card that it does or it has. And again, and I hate to say it, it can draw on its history. This is why Napoleon, the fact that Napoleon's army was only half French, it was a military coalition of Western nations and peoples against Russia. Hitler's army was not just German. It was a Western coalition of military powers and nations against Soviet Russia. The fact that they can say, look at our history. How many military alliances in the West that are formed to fight Russia are we going to have to face? And so this is the third one, i.e. NATO. So let's stop it now. And in fact, that's the words Putin used in his February 24th speech. He said, no more. We cannot accept this anymore. We've been lied to and deceived, not only in the 19th century and then with Hitler, but now in the 20th century, that is the 1990s. And so therefore now we've drawn the line, once bitten, twice jive. But again, but the expansion of NATO does not explain a lot of what's happening.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah. If you can do this one really quickly, it's come
Sure.
up a couple of times, and that is, what about Navalny? Does he have enough support to fill in a void?
He does among a certain element and segment of society, and that would be your urban, intellectual, educated people who are plugged into the internet, who are more global oriented and things like that. However, that is not the majority of the Russian population. Most of the Russian population, in fact, gets their news solely from TV, state-controlled TV. They do not get it from the internet.
Yeah.
It's unlike what we have in the United States. If more people, I don't know, get their news from Facebook than from CNN and Fox or whatever the case might be, is the opposite in Russia. And in fact, when you're in Russia, when you go outside of a major city like St. Petersburg or Moscow, you actually go back in time, where you can still see where certain communities still have not necessarily running water, where you still see horses in the field and stuff like that. And the thing is that these communities, who really are the ones that Putin's support comes from, they get their information solely from TV for the most part. That, unfortunately, is where Navalny is completely cut off from. And so what we get in the West is a very distorted picture of the liberal voices, the necessary liberal voices in Russia, like a Navalny, or back in the Soviet Union, like a Sakharov, or someone like that, who was a very famous dissident back then. But unfortunately, they don't necessarily represent a majority. So Navalny, I give him, what he's done is, just as brave as Zelensky now, and as Sakharov before in the 1970s and the 1980s. But I don't see really a chance for him now. He is still young, but unfortunately, we do know the story of someone like Boris Nemtsov, or Nemtsov, who was killed right outside the Kremlin, in fact. Just a few years before, he was a primary opponent as well. He was another person who was, urbane, et cetera, all these things, tapped into the new stuff and all that, and they just killed him. And of course, they have tried to kill Navalny, and so God knows.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we took that question, because that was really interesting, and the kind of perspective that only someone like you, an expert, could provide for us. So
I mean, he's a glimmer of hope, and there are other glimmers of hope. Some of those names who don't make necessarily the headlines, as it were, in the West, but at the same time, unfortunately, they're not united. And also, too, it's very important to keep in mind, this is also true in the Soviet Union. There were many dissidents, or that is, people who were against the Soviet Union, but they themselves weren't necessarily allies of each other. Many, for example, Solzhenitsyn, who is another famous dissident name, he was quite nationalist Russian, et cetera, as opposed to Sakharov, who was also anti-Soviet, who was quite liberal globalist. So, unfortunately, anti-Putinism is not necessarily a glue for these other voices as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Anyway, well, mindful of the time, unfortunately, we're out of it for this session. But Greg, thank you for making yourself available and sharing your expertise.
No, it was my pleasure. It was my pleasure.
For those of you who are in the classes celebrating the reunions this May and June, please check out the programming and registration. Amy's going to post that link in the chat now. I bring it up here because we do have a series of faculty spotlight series. So if you like talks like this, check out the schedule for talks like this, I guess you'd say. In fact, we do have a colleague in Fletcher speaking on cybersecurity with regards to the Ukrainian war, and that is, I think, on May 22nd, but that'll be on there. So hopefully, if you're around campus, you can join us for that. We'll also be hosting another webinar, the last in our What Matters to Me and Why series, on May 3rd at noon with Erin Coughlin D. Perez on climate change and global disaster, where she will talk about her work with the Red Cross in foresight and prevention and mitigation of harm presented by these global disasters. Thanks again to Greg. Thank you all to our attendees. Be well, and hope you can join us for another program in the future. Thanks.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. You're absolutely welcome. Bye-bye.